Right. Now, when you look at these two documents side by side, the main intentions of providing these two from the awarding organization side is that in the Word document that you see, what tends to happen is the awarding organization basically gives you a scenario to assume so that you have some sort of a storyline when you're trying to attempt the assignment.
Yes.
Okay, so the context, as we call it, or the storyline is actually present in the Word document. And then what it will also do in the second part would be ask you to produce a specific document or a specific type of evidence which is required to meet the criteria. So if you look at task 1, for example, it says you are required to produce an informal talk/workshop for people who are considering setting up their own business. Prepare a PowerPoint presentation with supporting notes. Is that okay? Now,
yes.
when you look at reading this and when you look at the unit specification on the left, what tends to happen is this is AC is assessment criteria 1.1, which you see at the bottom here.
Yeah.
Now, in this is the task 1.1 or AC 1.1. Now here, it will not specify in the unit specification when you look at it, is what is exactly required for you to be able to produce as evidence. That bit is basically the difference here in this bit here in the specification sheet. But this is important when you are trying to do the assignment and attempt the assignment. What it tends to do is it gives you the indicative content that you have to cover. If you scroll down to the second page, it will give you the type of indicative content that you have to put into the evidence which is required for this task.
Okay.
Is that making sense?
Yes, I can see that.
Okay. Now, just to relate this to, say, the handouts, the things that are sent to you today. Now, it says produce. If you look at the assignment brief here, it basically asks you to produce a PowerPoint presentation with support. Now, what I've sent to you is, if you look at it, is asking you to produce something called different types of business organizations providing local, national, global examples. So if you look at the evidence which I've sent you, kind of a handout which I've sent you for this particular task, it is already a PowerPoint presentation. So this will give you a clue that you have to produce something similar in terms of this activity to be able to meet the criteria. Right?
Yes.
So you're discussing the main types of organization which are in the spec sheet here. There are types of organization including private, public, government, voluntary, charitable. So what I'm trying to say effectively here is, if I just minimize this, that having the assignment brief and the specification sheets side by side to a certain extent helps you to understand what is the kind of evidence and the content of the evidence required to meet the criteria for the task.
Okay.
Is that okay? Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay. Now, the other thing which you will find, which is going to be useful for you, if I look at the Word document, which is the assignment brief given by the awarding organization, and if I scroll that and go to the end pages, there is some guideline which is given for assessors. Now, this is kind of a cheat sheet which I will use, or Phil or one of my colleagues will actually use to look at marking your assignment in the work that you submit. Now, in terms of a bit of a guideline, this is a guideline to the assessor to check and cherry pick from the evidence submitted that whether the student or the learner who submitted this evidence, their work actually meets the criteria for the evidence or not. So my suggestion to you is, when you start firming up a draft or an assignment at your end, the idea would be to go through this Word document, in a bit more detail, and then scroll to the back pages or the pages towards the end and look at the guidelines for assessors and understand what it is that the teacher or the tutor will actually be looking at marking or picking up as evidence from the work that you provided.
Okay.
Okay. So it clearly says, for this task, it says the learner must produce a PPT. Sorry. So it clearly says that it's you need to produce a PowerPoint presentation. And that PowerPoint presentation will need to have, supporting material, and should cover types of organizations, and it should talk about the stakeholders, and it will talk about the different objectives which the stakeholders have within these organizations. So when you look at the evidence that I've tried to view today on the email, this is directly relating to what is exactly required and being asked for in task 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3.
Okay.
So this is just 1.1, and you can, obviously develop a presentation from this. The objectives of task holders, this is a bit of an additional reading, but you're looking at pages 1, 2, 3, which will give you more of the related stuff which is required. And then you look at the handout 1.3, it will give you some other bits and pieces in terms of the presentation in particular to be able to cover, for the task 1.3. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So literally speaking, when you look at doing the assignment, my suggestion to you would be that you will straight away look at putting the task down onto a Word document. The way I would start an assignment would be I open a new document, and in the new document, what I would do is unit name, say 4.1, business environment, and then task 1.1. Before this, what I'm going to do is, if I look at the structure of the assignment, I'll start with a bit of introduction to summarize the unit. What is the unit and what is the overall objective that you understood. Task 1.1, and then I will say, okay, it will say produced as a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, something like that. And then you put task 1.2, and then obviously you start writing because that is required as a 1.2, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 is PowerPoint presentation, and then learning outcomes 2 onwards is a Word document.
Okay.
Okay. Now, at some stage, what you will have to do is you will have to look at doing referencing. So Harvard referencing, you'll have to look at doing referencing, because some of the material that you're including in this will require to be paraphrased and will require to be referenced, because you're looking at picking up definition, concepts, and the basic standard things which are coming across from maybe a book or some sort of journal or paper. Now, from my point of view, what I would suggest is, if you go on to, just close this, go on to say Moodle. If you open the ebook there, this book is something which comprehensively covers the entire unit. So when you are looking at, say, for example, the learning outcome 1, what you're looking at is basically picking up things like, the business organizations from here, and then go and we start looking at, the content bit of it, and then you references accordingly. So references are given at the end of each chapter for this particular, paragraph things that you pick up. And if you're picking it up, you're phrasing some of the stuff and then attributing the, the context of it to the relevant author or the person who's made that. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And if you want to revise what is Harvard referencing, I think what I'll do is I'll put a presentation here now, which will basically help you to understand how you need to do a bit of referencing from a point of view of Harvard referencing, which is required, for the assessment. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So literally, my suggestion was that obviously you need to follow in terms of how the draft would be prepared. So you're going task by task, and then for the task going as per the the evidence required, which is being asked, so that it is hitting the criteria. And then what it will do is obviously tend to meet when we look at the when we look at assessing, it meets the guideline which is required and prescribed by the awarding organization.
Okay.
Good stuff. Now let's look at let's get the third unit, just to look at a bit of an overview today of the third unit in terms of the introduction to communication. So I'm going to try and open this up here. 1 second. Now, in the context of this particular unit that we're going to be looking at studying, what we are primarily looking at is the requirements of why communication is important with business context. So in some cases, the content of this unit is quite generic in the sense it's quite something which could have been you must have studied previously. But the idea here is we are looking at, in particular, understanding developing some understanding in terms of what is the role of business communication in particular within an organization. And in terms of covering this particular topic, what we will be looking at, is 5 different learning outcomes. But the basic essence will be making you aware of, the types of communication models that we use with regards to when we work within a business environment or an organization, type of communications we use, like it's formal, informal, written, verbal, those kind of things. The model behind the communication and different types of models which are used and over the years developed for the reasons that the communication can be becoming more effective and more efficient. And then at a later date, what we will do is we'll press on with the fact that we want to be able to understand the different types of communication that we need to look at, which is in particular, things like when you do communication via letter, a formal one, when you do communications via email, which is a digital, and when you do communications via, for example, verbal communication, then it is to do with the fact that you're looking at, personal, impersonal, formal, informal, and those kind of things. And lastly, what we will look at is the role of technology in particular, and how does technology come in and play a very vital role in making communication, instant, more efficient, more productive, and how technology is being used within this context, like things like we use like facsimile or fax as we call it. We use email more or less in the office and organizations nowadays. The medium that we are using currently, which is things like video conferencing. So you have audio and video being used for communication. And last but not the least, we are also looking at other mediums like, basically briefly touching on other mediums like, we use LAN, WAN and MAN, for example, local area networks and, telecommunication in particular to support, connectivity between different branch offices or offices of an organization. And I think in terms of the evidence, what we are looking at is we will look at things which primarily will be required from an assignment point of view is to kind of depict that you've understood this particular unit from a context of, looking at different types of communication, what things are used in communicating, how it becomes effective, how communication shapes up a culture of the organization, what kind of, culture it develops, what helps it helps develop within the organization. So those are the kind of things that we'll look at in this particular unit. Now, we're looking at basically covering in today's session an overview of this particular unit and to understand a bit of theory, which is specifically related to learning outcome 1. And this presentation obviously is available on Moodle, on the learning platform. And I will then, after the session, send you an email with a handout, which is going to be predominantly a Word handout or a PDF document, which will provide, a bit more theory and background to the presentation that we are going through as of now. Is that okay?
Yep.
So we've got this presentation and I think I've got the handout here. That's fine. So looking at going through, some of these slides, there are about 30 slides, but I think some of them will primarily just skip through because self-explanatory. Now, that is what we are looking at covering today. So we are looking at communication models. And before we start, we will try and do a bit of an activity to try and see how much do we relate to what we want to be able to do as far as this particular unit, if that's okay with you.
Yep.
Okay, so now let's look at say an activity in terms of, let me ask you a few questions. So just randomly, tell me and answer these, what comes to your mind without thinking too much about it. First things first is, what do you think is the communication process? What is involved and what do you think makes a communication?
Verbal communication.
Right, okay.
Written communication, electronic communication.
That's absolutely fine. So these are what we are calling as types of communication, or different types of communications that we do. So it could be written, it could be verbal, it could be done through the digital medium, which could be email, right? A letter and things like that. So, so the second question that I want to ask you is, what is involved in the communication process? So where does a communication take place? How does it take place?
You got a sender, you got a receiver.
Right, that's brilliant. Yeah. So in the process of communication, what we are looking at predominantly is that when you do some communication, what we are looking at is there is always a sender or a person from which the message is originated. And at some stage, what we also look at is the person who's actually receiving the communication is the person who's called the receiver, and that receiver is able to decode the message, like an email that you receive, or you receive, for example, a letter through the post. Then the person is actually able to decode and understand the context of it. So if I get a letter through the post which is written in French and I don't understand French, then the intended use of sending that formal letter does not get accomplished because I am not able to understand what has actually been sent through the post. Okay, now, yes, so that is absolutely fine. Now, the other thing which I want to check with you is what do you think affects the process of communication? Are there any external things which can affect communication? You and me are having a communication right now. Do you think are there any external factors or things from beyond our control which can affect communication?
Anything can affect it, like if it's electronic communication.
Yeah.
If there's something wrong with the server, like a server breakdown, then it's going to stop the communication electronically.
Right, that's correct. Yeah. So basically, that is, if I put it in the terms, that is called distortion, or there is, a barrier, basically, which is going to kind of inhibit us to communicate effectively. So that's a good point. What else can you think of which can affect the process of communication?
Delays, such as if you send a letter out, if there's a postal delay, that can delay the letter from, it will delay the person receiving the letter, basically.
That is correct. So effectively, what you've said is another good point is that sometimes what tends to happen is in the process of communication, there is a loss of package. That means the entire, because the medium which has been chosen to communicate, sometimes there's distortion or there's a barrier which leads to a loss in the ability to communicate effectively, and that would mean what you've said cannot go across to the other person, in a complete sense. So that's also okay. What are the other things that you can think of? So there are other things which we can think of. Is the example is, for example, there could be a cultural difference. There could be differences which could come across in the way you communicate. So if you look at some sections or societies in the world, for example, when you look at Koreans and the Japanese, what you tend to see, you have a very subtle way of communicating face to face. So there is always a greeting gesture, which basically means they will bow down and wish you, and they will give you a business card which is with two hands. When you're obviously doing face to face communication or meeting the person face to face, in some cases you will find that these cultural differences also translate into the way you write to a particular person. So if you're writing to a boss, if you're writing to somebody superior in the organization, your communication would be slightly differently worded than when you're writing to a peer or a colleague in the same department. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So basically what we are looking at is some of the things that you've said is absolutely fine. And what we are trying to do is practice that into the context of now looking at, why is it important from a business context? And that is what we want to be able to understand at this level, at level 4, is that why communication is important and how it is effectively done at the business level in the organization to be able to propagate business, to be able to solicit more business, and obviously to accomplish aims and objectives which are set by the organization, and or in some cases you are given the responsibility to look at those operations. So let's go on to the slides and let's look at, say, for example, a few things in terms of looking at the various communication models. Now, over the years, what has happened is that, give me one second. So over the years, what has happened is, are you able to see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So over the years, what has happened is, because of the way the communication is happening, there is a specific business model which has evolved, and there's a process which has evolved. So as you can see on the slide, what it talks about is this is a representation of how a simple model of communication gets formed. I am the sender in this case. You're the receiver on your side, on the other side, and in between the transmission is happening of the message or the tutorial that we are doing right now through the audio-visual medium of a web meeting. And then when you are able to understand and respond to me, that kind of forms some sort of a feedback which is happening because of the method of communication. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if I have to break this down into in terms of what are the elements involved in developing a model of communication, what we have done is we've divided it into a couple of things, and the idea is to look at, for example, in this case, the method of communication that we're using is visual because you are able to see my screen. The nature is more or less practical and visual, both in that aspect because we're able to interact with the data and you're able to understand and ask me questions, and it's simultaneous, it's concurrent in the sense that it's happening instantly. The media that we are using right now is a combination of, again, text, images, pictures, and symbols. And the understanding ability is more or less instant and comprehensive because I'm using a PowerPoint slide as one of the options to look at delivering this particular session. Now, there is a bit of complexity because when you write a letter, you're writing a letter which is only using the the combination of text and words. But sometimes you communicate with the use of pictures, and you also use graphs and symbols or tables to communicate some data. So when you look at a financial statement or a finance manager giving a presentation and he makes use of graphs, tables, and other forms of data, then because he's using different forms of text to be able to give that information out to its audience, then that information has complexity in it in terms of it's not just plain simple English, it's not just words, it's not just sentences, but it has pictures, symbols, and graphs and other things. Now, one of the key things that we look at when we say communication is instantaneous, and one of the key factors which comes in is time. If I take you back maybe 3 or 4 decades back, just after the Second World War, for example, what we look at is at that point in time, the mass medium of communication predominantly was radio. Okay? And when you look at video, the transmittance of that, when it used to happen, you remember, I don't know whether you can recall or relate this, but I can now obviously relate this, not recall, is that there used to be something called a telegram. In the olden days, an instant message which had to be sent across to, say, for example, you had you were blessed with a baby boy or something, or there was a news which was supposed to be shared. What tended to happen was that there was a system of media communication which was used, which was called telegram. And the telegram used to be, transmitted using a Morse code, and on the other side, the person used to interpret and then type it out, and then used to be delivered. So communication was not that instant at that point in time. It required a bit of time for it to go and go from one location to the other location before the receiver got that communication. That happens today as well. And when you look at the example which which you also mentioned, that if I send you a letter, you send the letter by first class, second class, or by next day delivery, there is a time element which is involved in terms of the delivery of that message. So if I send it through post, it takes a bit of time for it to go across. But if we use electronic medium like an email or like a telephone, it is pretty much instant. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So there's an element of time also when we consider communication process. And sometimes, like I'm doing this particular tutorial, I keep asking you this question in the middle, is that okay? Is that understood? Is because what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to understand how effective the session is, and are you able to understand what I'm also saying? So there is a feedback that I've invited from your end to be able to understand this, and this is done through the route of me asking for feedback in the form of this question. Is that okay? Is that understood? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. So looking at some of the models, now there are a lot of models which have evolved over the years in terms of how communication is developed. And we'll look at a few of these models. So one of the models that we look at studying in particular is the Aristotle's model. And there are, as you can see in this particular model, there is a 4-step process. And this particular model that we get to see is predominantly used wherein you have a speaker who's making a speech, and there is an audience, and there's an occasion, and it is supposed to have some sort of a prescribed effect on the audience when the speaker is speaking. And this kind of a model is predominantly seen working in, say, for example, a training or a seminar which is happening, wherein the trainer or the person who's doing the training actually becomes the speaker, and the audience on the other side is basically, receiving that particular feedback and is looking at, embracing in terms of the knowledge being given or the things being discussed in that particular training and seminar. You also get to see this in the form of, working within, say, for example, speeches or, events which happen, wherein there is a speaker which will normally make a speech, and that speech will then be interpreted by the audience, and it is supposed to bring across some sort of an effect. So a political rally, for example, when you look at, is also an example wherein this particular model is most commonly used. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. Now, there are other models. So second model is called the Lasswells Model, and this particular model divides the process into 5 stages. It talks about things like who's the communicator, what is the message, through which medium or channel the message is sent, how is the receiver receiving it, and what kind of an effect it has on the receiver. So there is a bit of a control which is exercised in this particular model, and that control tends to be because of the choice of medium being chosen and the type of receiver being used, the type of receiver being chosen to receive that message. So here, what tends to happen is the sender has a bit of a control on sending that communication across to the receiver. A typical example of this is when you receive an email from the head of department, for example, where you work, you get an email from your boss, and that email has only come to you specifically, and it's not gone to any of your other colleagues or peers in the department. So here you're able to direct that particular communication across to a specific person, and the sender who's sending that across, because it's confidential or it's something which is only intended for you, basically tends to be the information which is addressed to you directly as against a mass audience or a group of audience. So the sender can exercise that they can send this email to you and a couple of other colleagues, but leave some of the colleagues out. Do you see the difference?
Yes.
So this model is predominantly seen when you're writing emails, you're sending communication across in the form of letters and things like that, and you address it to a group of people or a specific group of audience, so that the information is only intended for that particular person rather than as against the entire crowd, if you compare that to the Aristotle's model. Okay?
Okay.
This one that we look at is called the Vivo model, and this particular model is designed specifically to look at developing an effective medium of communication between the sender and the receiver. And here the example which is given is in the form of when you pick up the phone and you speak to a person directly, right? So if I have to speak to, say, in this case, you, and confirm the class timings, I don't want to be speaking to your friend or somebody in your family to be able to tell you a message. What I would do is, if I have your contact number and details, I'll pick up the phone and speak to you directly. So here the information source, which is the source of, which is the information which is transmitted by the sender, is directly sent over to the receiver, but you use a channel or a type of a channel in the middle to be able to communicate or transmit that information. And that channel, in most cases where direct communication happens, could be an email, could be a letter, could be a telephone, a fax machine, or something which you have direct access to. And the receiver is able to get that message pretty much directly without having any other intervention in the middle from any other person or any other form of medium. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah.
The next model is called the Scarans Model, and this model, basically uses between the sender and receiver. The key differences in this model is there is a encoder. That means you try and encode the information because it might be secretive or sensitive in nature, and that information is only intended for a particular person who has some sort of a responsibility or a position within the organization. So sometimes when you send an email, what you do is you mark it confidential. Have you seen that?
Yeah, and password protected attachments. Yeah.
That is correct. Absolutely spot on. And you will also see that in some cases, what tends to happen is when you send that email, you also mark it as urgent or important, and you use those symbols within the email which are there. So there is where we use this particular model. And an old example, if I look at, when I say old example, an example from the olden times would be the use of Morse code, or spies, when they use communication between different locations or in warring locations, like in the World War scenario 1 and 2, the communication intended was always encoded and on a different frequency, because they wanted the communication from the center to only go across to their own troops rather than the enemy troops or across the enemy lines. So this particular model will always use an encryption. In modern days context, when we talk about when you send an email or a file, you will probably encrypt the file or password protected, as you mentioned, so that the person on the other side who has the right password or the access to it can only decode the information in the part of the communication process. Okay.
Okay.
Now, one of the other models that we look at is something called the Riley model. Now, here, what you need to imagine is the difference in this model against the other models is, if you imagine you are in a class and the teacher actually breaks you into a different group and asks the groups to do a particular activity, or say brainstorming. And what will tend to happen in this case is, when the groups are formed, those groups will have communications among themselves and amongst the others in the group. So if I break you up into an activity wherein you are a part of one group and I'm a part of the other group, but I'm on the other team, and you're in one team, team A and the team B, then what tends to happen is the people in the same group starts talking to or communicating with people in the other team, but they have discussions within groups. So this particular model you will get to see when you attend a seminar, a training session, or you attend, say, for example, a company event. And what will happen is they will break you down into groups to manage you quite well, and make the groups manageable in terms of both literally looking at managing the group of people. If in a large gathering, say for example, you have 500 guests, what you tend to do is you brand them or name them in certain categories in a way wherein it's easier for a particular person to be able to manage, like a team leader. So a good example of this would be the call center, for example. And in the call center, if it's a 100-seat call center, they will typically have about 5 or 10 team leaders. Each team leader is managing about 10 individuals. And what they tend to do is they tend to have conversations within the group. But one team leader and his team, when they have a conversation with the other team and the team leader, they then talk to each other in groups, and the messages are then exchanged. So it becomes more or less like a social system or a social structure, wherein you are interacting in groups rather than in individual basis. Is that okay?
Yeah.
This is employed also in a situation wherein you'll get to see that the group tasks or group activities are given, and those activities require not just individual contribution, but they require contribution from a group of people within that same, from a group of individuals within the same group to be able to accomplish the task. So this kind of a model you will get to see wherein there's a social system or a gathering. So, for example, you go to a marriage or you go to, say, for example, a social event wherein you will get into the room, you'll have some bits of conversation with everyone. And at some stage, when you become comfortable with a particular group, you'll actually tend to have that conversation and sit down and, be a bit more relaxed, but tend to interact throughout the evening within that group itself. Okay. Other model that we are looking at is something called the Burlesque Model, and this particular model takes into aspect the emotional, aspect of the message. Now, one of the things that you will normally look at within the Burlesque Model will be is that it follows a code which is called the SMCR code, which is source, message, channel, and receiver. And this model generally would tend to relate to situations. So you have a friend who's very close to you and he's been blessed with a baby. So the model will have a bit of an emotional message. When you call him up or call her up in particular, there is an emotional attachment in terms of the message going across saying that, okay, congratulations, I'm really happy for you, and things like that. So here the source is primary. It could be a person, a group of individuals, or it could be the company in particular. The message tends to have information, but it could also have your personal thoughts and emotions going into the message. And this then can also be communicated through the use of body language, or maybe some sort of a code between which you and the other person understands. Now, if it is going to be distance related, for example, you're calling up the hospital where obviously your friends and your close friend has had a baby, or in this case maybe say you say, for example, passing on condolences if somebody's passed away, then if you use a medium like a telephone or a letter, then in that case you're looking at a particular selection of a channel which makes that message much more appropriate to be transmitted. And if it's face to face, then you use the emotions and body language to be able to send that message across, or the feelings, you express that feelings to go across to that person, and that is why you use the Burlesque model. Now, within the office context, imagine you're having a small gathering and your line manager or your boss essentially ends up calling all the colleagues in the department to share a bit of news. And this could be a share of a bit of news which is to do with the promotion of one of your colleagues. So what then tends to happen is a bit of an emotion, a clap, and a joke, and you share a couple of things, and you all get together and you have this bit of emotion. Okay, you deserved it, and congratulations and things like that. So those kind of instances where you see communication happening, at a company level, at a personal level, you'll get to see that the Burlesque model is primarily put into practice. Is that okay?
Yep.
Any questions on this so far?
Yeah, I think that's it really. That's okay.
Okay, good stuff. The other bit that we will look at is there's a contemporary model. Now, this particular model has become, you look at all those models, they work within a particular situation, but over the years, what has happened is most of these models have got merged, and they've got merged into something called the contemporary model. And this particular model basically uses modern day style of communication because of the incorporation of telecommunication technology in particular, and the way we are sending these messages across. So in this particular model, you have a communicator. There's always an encoding of message which happens with gift wrapping or kind of wrapping the message. It travels through a medium. Receiver gets it. There's a bit of decoding, and then you send a feedback. A classical example of this is an email. So you use like a Microsoft Outlook. You will send an email across. It will only go to the intended recipient. That particular person's email address is put across. When he or she receives it, they need to have a compatible software to be able to decode and read that message. And then when you reply to the message, going back to the sender, you're actually sending some feedback, which is going through the email medium again. So this model has become synonymous with modern day usage, and it's called the contemporary model, and we get to see this used more and more often in most of the situations, whether it's to do with office environment or formal or informal environments both. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, going to the second bit. This is a bit which is quite clear. We are looking at now some advantages of different types of communication. Now, when we look at the types of communication you initially mentioned, we can do verbal, written, oral communication. Communication can be through body language and a combination of these. So like I'm delivering a session right now, I'm using body language, eye contact, verbal, and using technology as well. So there are different forms of communication I'm doing, but I'm kind of merging some of these mediums now to be able to deliver this particular session. So what we are looking at is, in this particular section, looking at understanding the advantages and disadvantages of a particular type of communication. So first one that we'll look at covering is written. Now, written communication, when do you think written communication is done? Written communications are done predominantly when you want to create some sort of a record. An example, if you can think of, is you're unhappy with your, say, broadband provider or your telephone provider, and your telephone line is down. You call them up, you raise a complaint, and you speak to customer services over the phone. But if this is something which is happening or recurring again and again, and this is becoming a nuisance or is becoming a sore point, then what you tend to do is you create a permanent record by sending a formal letter of complaint.
Yeah.
Correct? So written communication, when you look at, is a type of communication which normally creates record. So in the business organization, when you look at an example would be when you do minutes of the meeting, when your boss calls a meeting or there is a regular monthly meeting which happens, there is always somebody who's doing the minutes. There's a minute taker. And the idea is that those who have not been able to attend would essentially end up getting a copy of the minutes of the meeting and will be able to go through that. So it is a permanent record which is created. It becomes a legal document, like a letter of formal complaint that you send across. In some cases, when you send an email, you CC some of the individuals in, because you're trying to, not just speak to the person, but maybe the line manager and the head of department. So it can be sent across, and copies of that can be sent across to multiple people at a time, because it is creating a record. And in other cases, other advantages would be things like you could suitably address the message and choose a medium which could be sending a detailed message, a brief message, or an official message or communication. An example here would be when a company prints out an annual general report, something which is an annual record of its operations across the year. And that is something, when it is published, a company's report is basically nothing but an official report which is published, and it's a long message or a medium of written communication, because it captures everything like the sales, the financial operations, developments in terms of R&D, and a couple of other things which it will capture. Now, written forms of communication are predominantly detailed. You try and have an element wherein you have you narrate a story, which is you have a beginning, you have the middle, and you have an end, because you're trying to explain everything in a bit more detail. And you will normally see that written communication within the company is done, for example, in cases wherein you're trying to set policies and processes in place or give out roles and responsibilities. So when you have a new employee joining the organization, you will normally see that you get an employee handbook. The handbook will essentially be a written or a printed document which will give you the do's and don'ts, which are expected of you, and things like that. Isn't it?
Yes.
And again, we look at some of the disadvantages very briefly. Is that sometimes permanent record, take time to create. They could have, there are lots of iterations which you go through, so that you try and eliminate errors, and sometimes make sure that they are accurate and very factual. The disadvantage is that, again, one of the other things could be they are highly professional documents. They lack a personal touch. So you can't write things like "I hope you're well" or "cheers" and things like that. You'll normally have "yours sincerely" or "your faithfully," things like that. They are not in some cases, they're not required at all levels of employees. So if you have a formal communication, you're normally sending that across to a manager, sending that across to raise a formal complaint. You're not sending it to a customer executive or a particular person, but somebody in the position of authority. Sometimes you will see that they lack confidentiality. Now, there is a term that we normally get to hear in BBC or in the news channels, which is under the Freedom of Regulation Act or under the Freedom of Information Act. We have obtained this information. So written communication does not necessarily have confidentiality, because after a point in time, the government has to release records, and those can then be obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. Written communication, you will also see, does not provide instant feedback. This is important. If you send a letter, you'll normally see a solicitor will take about 28 days, and it is expected that they have a couple of business days to be able to reply back to your query, isn't it? As against this, if I do a verbal communication, to speak to somebody on the phone, the person will more or less give you instant feedback, isn't it? You ask a question, and the person will choose to answer the question or not answer the question, but you'll more or less end up getting instant feedback. And the other disadvantage, which is also important, is that once you release a written document, it cannot be changed, it cannot be undone. So it does create a permanent record, but if it's got any errors in it, or if it's got something which is not supposed to be published, then you cannot recall these documents, because once they are in public domain, they are available and they are released, and modifications are impossible to be done. Imagine a case of a newspaper that you buy in the morning. So if the editors have made a mistake in checking a particular fact and it's been printed, there's no way that that can be recalled. They have to print something called an addendum or a correction the next day to be able to correct that new piece of news or article. Isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, verbal communication. Briefly, it's time-saving, quick dissemination. That means pretty much instant. It lacks documentation, so it normally becomes informal in most cases. You tend to have small meetings or gatherings while having a cup of tea or a coffee with your colleague in the office, and most of these communications are verbal. But when it comes to you handing over a piece of work to your colleague, then you normally would do the handover through the written email, isn't it?
Yes. So
things that we've discussed in written communication, you'll find that they are kind of more or less opposite to what we do in verbal communication instances. There are detailed clarifications and queries which can be raised at the same time in a meeting. For example, you do not understand a point, you can raise a query, and then that is pretty much instantly answered. Even if you are digressing from what is being talked about, that could be a disadvantage, but more or less it's kind of instant. There are personal touches to the communication when it happens verbally, because there's a tone of voice in which it is spoken, and you have that conversation. Sometimes you're having gossips, and those are one-on-one communications. But if you are discussing something in a group, it can have a personal touch where you're trying to explain as a colleague or as a peer or as a boss. But in some cases, it is more or less one-to-one, and the messages that you do or communicate are very effective, because there is not much conflict. When you speak to somebody who's senior enough verbally, you know what is your boundary, and you kind of try to stay within that boundary when you're doing that communication, and you're not overstepping into a person's shoe or in his role to be able to do that conversation in your context. Is that okay? Verbal communications do not have a personal permanent record, because nobody is recording the conversation, or in some cases, they are just for the sake of communications between individuals. So again, it does not create a permanent record. It can create a permanent record in verbal communications when you call up a company and they say, we'll be recording these calls for quality and monitoring purposes.
Yeah.
Okay, something that you can relate to. Now, visual communication. The visual is, obviously you look at sign language is a form of visual communications for the people who have a bit of disability in terms of visual impairment. So visual communication, or you cannot hear, so this is a disability, and in those cases you will normally see visual communication being used. And then there are some advantages, like it transcends the barrier of language. So in the mornings when you listen to BBC News, you also have sign language or visual communication happening. Have you seen that?
Yes.
It simplifies the message. It's easy to understand and interpret. A picture is worth 1,000 words, as they normally say. So in some cases, when you're trying to put a point across, is when you're in a training or a seminar, what the person will be able to do is put a picture across on the board and ask you to interpret, and it sometimes becomes easy to understand and explain that point of view, or the key point being made. Now, in some cases, it is very different from verbal and written communication, is because visual communication catches immediate attention, right?
Yeah.
And the advantage of that could be that in some cases there is no interaction whatsoever if the communicator leaves the room. So maybe in a room there is, say for example, a quiz happening or a contest happening, and sometimes what tends to happen is if it doesn't kind of break the ice with you, you end up leaving. Oh, this is not something for me, and you end up leaving. So there is no feedback or no room for feedback. If you do not like the activity or do not like, you can choose not to participate in that, and in those cases it becomes a disadvantage. Any questions on
that? No, not yet.
Okay, good stuff. The last form of communication that we look at is electronic, and I think some of the points that we have clearly come across on the advantages and disadvantages, self-explanatory, to be honest. It's instant, easy to communicate, keeps records in case of mails. So it is a combination of the verbal and written communication, and this then tends to translate into something which we use now technology for, and you can send large amounts of information across to people. Speed and creation of the information is almost instant, and because we are all producing, this is an important point, we're all producing information. Data then converts to knowledge, knowledge then converts to communication converts into data, data converts into communication, communication converts into knowledge. So, and knowledge at some stage is also defined as information. So information, communication, and knowledge. Now, because there is so much being produced and there are so many different types of communications being produced, a typical example would be when you look at Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, these kind of media, social medias in particular. Now, because there's so much being produced, at the end of the day, the technology is also helping us to effectively manage this form of communication. That means you can back up the communication onto a server, you can create archives, you can store it, you can restore it, you can delete it. All that is possible with the electronic medium of communication. Is that something that you're aware of?
Yes, because I work in the local government.
Okay.
So we do have something similar there as well. Like we got servers.
There you go.
Server backs up all our data.
Yeah, correct. So electronic form of communication now allows us to manage other channels and also store and manage it effectively for usage in future also, or various other purposes for which it can be stored. The other classification that we will look at very briefly would be, conscious of time, is formal and informal communication. Now, there are ways to communicate or speak or transmit the message, and in some cases what we do this is in the form of something called formal communication. Now, formal communication basically looks at increasing efficiency, looks at these points which are on the left hand side: easy communication system, permanent record, disciplined approach. And in some cases it also looks at delegation of authority, and multiple modes are available. Informal, on the other hand, has the exact opposites of what has been mentioned here. Is it improves interpersonal relationship because you get a chance to be able to interact with the individual, understand the individual, and then appropriately tailor your message, which goes across to the person and is much more receptive. The person on the other side is much more receptive to that form of communication because of the personal touch being added. The other things that we look at is informal communication can use lots of mediums. So you can informally communicate through an SMS, you can send an email, you can also communicate verbally, and in some cases, this tends to be the preferred medium of interaction. Now, a typical example here would be that you had a bit of a tussle or a argument with one of your colleagues, and another colleague steps in to kind of mediate that particular process of the argument, and that then tends to happen because there is an alternative way of interacting through the informal medium, and then getting to a resolve wherein the problem or that misunderstanding is solved. So informal communication provides certain advantages, and it is used in certain situations or context which are specific and not necessarily matching the ones and the advantages which the formal form of communication provides. Informal communication also looks at free flow of information, to a certain extent. If you're in a room and you're talking to a couple of people, there's a lot of free flow of information which is happening. That means somebody who's standing beside you can actually also overhear and get that information, even if it's not intended for that person. Have you seen that? So when you're in public places in particular, sometimes what you do is you tend to have a conversation in a very informal way, wherein other people around you can also receive that information, even if it's not intended for them.
Yes.
Okay. Now, there are something called 7 C's of communication, which make it effective. Now, at the end of the day, why we are looking at studying this in the business context is, in businesses, when you look at the communication, the essence of communication in particular, it is to do with making everything more productive, more efficient, and more related and personalized. So there is a model which is called the 7 C's of effective communication, and this is something which is used as a model to be able to make whatever you're transmitting as a message, formally, informally, written, verbal, but it makes it much more effective for the other person on the other side to be able to understand it. And these 7 C's are briefly defined here. So clarity in terms of message. That means you're trying to be very specific. Complete is you're trying to communicate the message in completeness. That means I'm not going to say things to you which can be interpreted in a way wherein there are fill in the blanks. You look at conciseness, you look at consideration. So in certain cases, you have to be sensitive. You have to have a bit of mindset to be able to talk to that person. If you're talking to a person who's senior enough to you or an elderly person, then you have to have that consideration in mind to be able to transmit and communicate appropriately that message that you're trying to send across. It needs to have concreteness. That means the message has no fuzzy logic, or it does not have duplicate meanings or multiple meanings. The message should not be interpreted in a way wherein I say, an example is, if the office decides to have an Easter break, and that break is something which you are trying to have it on your calendar, the employee calendar, then in that case what happens is, what will happen is the HR department will actually make the calendar and specify the dates on which the Easter break will essentially happen within the office. Have you seen that? Some of the things which the HR puts out will basically mean that they will put it out in black and white, and that will be printed out as a calendar, so that the national holidays, for example, the additional days on which the office is going to be off is actually available to you, and that is without a shadow of doubt is decided, and it's very concrete in terms of the holidays that are available. Yes. So sometimes you have to look at that from an instant. The message has to have concreteness. That means it has to be factually accurate before it is put out to the audience. Then you also look at the elements of courtesy. When we talk about the emotional sense, if you're, say, communicating condolences or happy occasions and things like that, you have to have that courtesy to be able to, or in situations wherein you're writing a business letter or a formal letter to, make a job application, you write a covering letter, you have to be sounding very courteous, but at the same point in time, you're actually reflecting something which is totally factual and talks about or gives a very true impression of yourself when you're going in for a job interview. And then lastly, we look at correctness. Now, correctness is to do with the fact, again, the message should not have errors. So if you're writing a letter, you check your spellings, you check the grammar. If you're doing a verbal communication or you're doing a presentation, you pick your words very carefully so that it does not have any negative impact or negative meanings, or intended meaning of the message is quite clear in terms of being that being very correct, because it's going to an audience which is going to be able to reflect on it, and then that reflection should trigger a particular aspect that you have planned for because of that medium, or that communication, rather than the adverse aspect, which is in terms of an impression which can be formed or a perception which can be formed.
Okay.
Now, this picture is not clear, but there are something called barriers to effective communication. And we discussed some of these in the beginning. When we look at barriers, is the elements of communication that we classified can sometimes become barriers. So, for example, time. If you want the communication to go across, sometimes you do see that the emails don't go across quite efficiently because they've got lost, or the servers delayed the transmission, and because of which sometimes important pieces of information do not get to the other side on time. Barriers could be sometimes in a training seminar, what you see is that the trainer would say that, okay, feel free to ask me questions, but if someone starts asking too many questions, it disrupts the whole flow of the seminar, of that training session. And then what tends to happen is the flow breaks, and the people lose their interest in terms of that particular training and seminar. So they might lose interest in particular, while that training is happening, or it creates a bit of a discomfort if you have a mobile phone call coming while the training is happening, and you tend to create a distraction. So these are considered as barriers to effective communication. And what we've done is define barriers onto these slides to try and give them a bit of context in terms of, with examples, why they are considered barriers for effective communication. Simple enough to go through to understand at this moment, and that is where what we will do is we will stop today's session. So what we have looked at covering today in particular is the overview of the unit and the theoretical aspects, which are predominantly why do we study communication in the business context, the process of communication, and the different models and the barriers to communication. So this bit in terms of the presentation covers the learning outcome 1. And I'm going to try and send you a handout, which basically then will give you a bit more reading material with examples to cover the learning outcome 1 in terms of understanding the process of communication, theories and models behind it, barriers, what makes it effective, and in what instances are what different types of communications used, things like formal, informal, written, verbal, and body language. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Good stuff. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me or drop me an email, and what I'll do is I'll come back on this, as soon as, and then we have another session that is planned for tomorrow on this particular unit.
Okay.
What we'll do is when we start this session tomorrow, I'm going to try and see if I can. I have to go to my son's football, trophy ceremony for a presentation tomorrow. Is it okay if we delay that session to a later time in the evening, say 8:30?
Yeah, that's fine.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Now, what I'll do is I'll revise the invite, send it over to you. But the other thing which I want to also say is when we start the session tomorrow, this is more or less a practical unit. I think you'll enjoy doing this particular assignment is because it is mostly a combination of PowerPoint presentations that you have to develop. And it is more practical in nature, in the sense you need to provide an evidence of a written letter or a written email, a formal letter of communication, some presentation that you have to do using PowerPoint slides. So tomorrow when we start the session, what I'm going to do is basically discuss the assignment brief first, so that we are clear that which areas in particular of the brief require you to produce PowerPoint presentation, or maybe provide evidence, which are practical evidences like an email, a letter, a complaint that you've sent, or things like that. And that will then, towards the end, we will discuss the theoretical aspects of it. So when you start doing your draft assignment, it is more or less going to be more of evidence in terms of presentation slides and the actual pieces of communication that you do, which will be covered, which will be covering the requirement for this particular assignment.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
No worries, Phil. You have a good rest of the evening. Have a good evening ahead, and then hopefully I'll catch up with you tomorrow.
Thanks. You too.
Okay. Take care.
You too. Thanks.